Joining us now, editor-in-chief of Lawfare and an MSNBC legal analyst, Benjamin Wittes. His new piece in The Atlantic is entitled, "I know Brett Kavanaugh, but I wouldn't confirm him." Also with us, former Assistant United States Attorney in the Criminal Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, Daniel Goldman. He has a new piece for NBCNews.com Think site that takes a critical look at the letter that GOP prosecutor Rachel Mitchell sent about Christine Blasey Ford's potential case. Fascinating angles here with these guests, Joe.
Yeah, Benjamin Wittes, thanks so much for being with us, and as always, thank you for the Lawfare podcast.
He loves
along
it.
Along with my daily nutrients, it's the only way I get through the day. It's extraordinary.
Thank you.
So let's talk about Brett Kavanaugh. I was just going on a little rant before that I thought that there were a lot of wild accusations going out there, but that being said, he still wouldn't want him on the Supreme Court for a lot of reasons, even though I'm conservative. You actually know him and have known him and believe he shouldn't be on the Supreme Court. Why is that?
Well, so I've known Brett Kavanaugh for 20 years. I've always liked him. I was excited when he was nominated because it struck me as by far the most attractive nominee that among the people that Trump was considering. And he's somebody who I've always thought of as a distinguished conservative judge whose career I have admired. I believe that Christine Blasey Ford's story, as presented Thursday before the Senate Judiciary Committee, is frankly more credible and believable than his defense against it. I also believe he did not show the sort of candor about a range of things that one should expect and demand from a Supreme Court nominee or any judge, even when under intense personal pressure of the sort that he's clearly under. And I also think he showed a, frankly partisan and conspiratorial streak that, in my experience with him, I have never seen before, and I was deeply shocked by. And for all of those reasons, I was just left after Thursday thinking that I cannot support his nomination anymore.
Hey, Ben, it's Willie Geist. There were some people who watched, I would say a lot of people who watched the hearing on Thursday, watched Judge Kavanaugh's testimony and thought, well, even if he's not guilty of what he's accused of here by Dr. Ford, the temperament he showed in that room, the hot-headedness, some people said, and a bit of a political bent, talking about a Clinton conspiracy against him and this being a reaction to President Trump. He sounded political. Are you convinced by those arguments that even if the Dr. Ford accusation doesn't hold up, his performance on Thursday means he shouldn't be on the bench?
Well, so I think if you imagine that he is wholly innocent of everything that she has accused him of, that is an extremely hard question in the sense that I can totally understand how somebody in that circumstance would be excessive and would, let emotion run away with him. And I go back and forth with myself whether independently I would be unable to forgive that if I believed the substance of the allegations to be wholly without merit.
Right.
That said, I think the temperament that he showed and the partisanship that he showed are deeply upsetting. And, I don't know how you ask a reasonable pro-choice Democrat to be comfortable with his sitting on a case that might, say, involve overturning Roe v. Wade or partisan gerrymandering or, any of the other many issues on which the parties are split after he has, looked the country in the eye and said this whole thing about Christine Blasey Ford is simply a function of a conspiracy of Democrats lying in wait for him because he did too well in his first hearing. And I think once you've done that, you've kind of ripped the Band-Aid off the wound and, sort of showed a side of yourself that is really not what we want in a justice.
Ben, John Podhoretz here. Can I just point out that on September 21st, you said that Kavanaugh should withdraw his own nomination because Christine Blasey Ford's claims seem credible to you and that the burden of proof was on him? I would argue that this attitude, that the burden of proof was on Kavanaugh, is precisely the attitude that has caused the Republican surge. And it leads me to question, you've already said, you said before his testimony that he should withdraw his nomination. So now that you're saying that he should withdraw his nomination because his temperament is bad and he was too partisan, leads me to believe that you came in with a fixed attitude and that it is not entirely, this is not entirely a discovery that you just made after the testimony.
So let me both agree with you and contradict you. First of all, I did come in with a fixed attitude. I came with a fixed attitude that I believed the burden was on Brett Kavanaugh, as I think the burden is always on the nominee in a situation in which questions have arisen and you have to get to 50 votes. You bear the burden of persuasion, and that's just the way our nomination system, in fact, works. So,
but you meant the burden of proof
did
about Blasey Ford's allegations.
Yeah, so
not about getting to 51.
Well,
that's not what you said.
Actually, it is what I said. There are. If you're a nominee and somebody is, and the outstanding issue about your nomination is an allegation against you and you don't have 50 votes, the burden of proof is in fact on you.
Okay, I want to quote you because here's what you said.
Yeah.
The only plausible defense now for him is self-exculpation on the facts. And in
Correct.
this endeavor, Kavanaugh himself bears the burden of proof. That's a moral claim, not a political claim.
So
The burden of proof is on him to disprove Christine Blasey Ford's allegations. That
Correct.
I think is a horrible standard.
So two things. One is, if you read the article carefully, I made both a normative and a descriptive argument as to it. I stand by the normative claim, but I also want to say, look, I did come in with a fixed presumption also that Brett Kavanaugh would be a good justice and would be somebody who I would, want to see confirmed under normal circumstances. I also want to say I did not say he should withdraw. I said he should withdraw if he is unable to defend himself in a persuasive fashion without attacking her. And the question, I think he answered that question on Thursday, and he answered it pretty decisively. He was not able to defend himself in a persuasive fashion, in my view, and he had to go on the attack against the Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats and other unnamed and named liberals and Democrats. And I just don't think that's an appropriate way for a candidate for a nomination to the Supreme Court to behave.
All right, Mike Barnicle.
Daniel, Ben obviously has a strong opinion, but he has no vote on the committee. Rachel Mitchell has a strong opinion. She has no vote. Rachel Mitchell is the woman who was hired by the Republican majority as a prosecutor to ask questions instead of the senators asking questions. She maintained in a memo that she provided the committee that no rational prosecutor would bring charges against Judge Kavanaugh on the sexual assault case. You, in your piece on NBCnews.com, disagree. Tell us why.
She went even further, and she said that she would not even, not only is it not a case of beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's also not even a preponderance of the evidence. And Rachel Mitchell's memo is somewhat of a microcosm of the problems that we're seeing with this Kavanaugh nomination. She simply evaluated, in I think a very slanted way, Dr. Ford's testimony. This whole dynamic in this hearing was was set up falsely as a he said, she said. And I say falsely because there was no investigation done prior to the hearing. And as a prosecutor, she should know better that you cannot actually assess a case or the credibility of anyone unless you do an investigation. Unless, in the very unusual case that we have here, there is a third person alleged to be there and you don't interview that person. But what's even worse is that her memo, which is set up as a he said, she said, does not even evaluate the he of what he said. It is simply an assessment of what Dr. Ford says, and it doesn't even get into Brett Kavanaugh's testimony. And I think what we're seeing here now, as we are past that and we are into an FBI investigation, is that it's still not a fulsome and complete investigation. I feel bad for my former colleagues at the FBI because I am certain that they would like to do a real investigation where they follow leads, they look for documentary evidence, they speak to all witnesses who may have information about this. And they can do that in a short period of time. And it very well may be, as John pointed out earlier this morning, that this investigation does not yield any more evidence to support Dr. Ford's allegations or to contradict what Brett Kavanaugh said. And in that case, then, there's a much better case to be made for Brett Kavanaugh to be confirmed. But without that full investigation, we're left with kind of a rigged system and a very hollow assessment that there is no corroboration. Well, there's no corroboration if you don't look for corroboration. And that's ultimately the problem that we're doing.
But the FBI now has interviewed Mark Judge, the one person allegedly who can corroborate the story. But you and I were talking before the show. The question remains, why wouldn't the FBI, as both an investigative matter and a political matter, to say we covered all our bases, go back and talk to Dr. Ford and go back and talk to Judge Kavanaugh so they could say, we didn't do the investigation the way we would typically do it, but we did talk to all the relevant and key witnesses here?
So what we're hearing is that the White House, which is directing this investigation because it's a background investigation, it's not a criminal investigation, although I actually think that that's really the only difference, is that the White House is directing it. It still should be an investigation into the allegations, which should include Brett Kavanaugh's truthfulness, because that goes very much to his defense of the allegations. But the concern that we have here is that the White House is saying, well, she already testified and she gave a long opening statement. She has said everything that she has to say. If the FBI were allowed to do this properly, though, they would go and they would meet with her and they would try to piece together the incident in lots of different ways, which they're very skilled at doing. They'd try to jog her memory, try to identify the house, maybe go find the house, see if it matches her description, etc. They would also meet with Brett Kavanaugh, and Brett Kavanaugh would not be able to deflect and evade the questions that, as he did at the hearing. He would not be able to answer questions with questions. He would actually have to be pinned down and respond to the questions.
Why aren't they interviewing those two witnesses?
Because the White House apparently, the only reason would be because the White House is not letting them. In any FBI investigation, they would, of course, go back and meet with the critical witnesses.
Well, and we should point out, in defense of the FBI, that the White House is the client.
Absolutely. And that's the problem here. That's unfortunate for the FBI, because they're going to come out looking bad.
Yeah.
All right. So, Ben Wittes, thank you very much. I appreciate your being on the show this morning. Daniel, stay with us.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.